Big week, of course, in Canberra budget. Industrial relations changes as well for many. What might be the bigger news of the week. Joining me now is our federal political reporter for the Australian, Sarah Ison, Australian Financial Review economics correspondent, Ron Misen. Thanks both for your time. Budget, probably still the main story, I guess. What was your sort of macro takeout of the document that was handed down?
I mean, I think it was, the whole thing was just this message of just restraint. We were hit over the head with it for so many times, which was good. I mean, Labor was very keen to press that home, especially as it's trying to cut a bit of money from different departments in its audit and so on. I think it is interesting, particularly this line that's coming out, that I found Labor trying to sort of change what has been this really old narrative about Labor spends all this money and the Libs are very conservative with their spending. You would have heard Chalmers since Tuesday in QT and saying, like, we have done something that would be unrecognisable to the Liberals with all of these savings and so on. So it is almost like flipping this whole narrative around, which I found really, really interesting. So I think they've sort of hit the ground running with trying to have this narrative of they're very fiscally responsible. They've been in opposition for a decade, facing the line that they're not, and now they're trying to prove in this budget that they are.
Look, they were never really going to be able to shell out countless billions. It would have been madness given what the RBA is doing. But I guess just even that temptation to have a power rebate, maybe the one in the middle of next year, that not even that was taken up, does seem to show that it took some discipline to hand down this document amidst the cost of living crisis, that they didn't want to hand out just something to get a headline out there.
Yeah, look, certainly the Treasurer has just tried to make hay from that, basically saying that in light of what's happening with inflation, we saw that the day after the budget, the inflation hit a 32-year high, 7.3%. Any additional expenditure is potentially only going to drive that up. And in his post-budget speech to the National Press Club, he made the point that inflation was the driving sort of framework for this budget, because the last thing you want is to be putting more money into the economy, to be driving up prices further, which is going to force the Reserve Bank to go harder, which is going to make life more difficult for people. So it's kind of a delayed gratification type thing. We need you to sort of sit tight now because it means it's going to be better over the medium term.
Inflation is the enemy kind of thing, this scary thing.
The dragon,
I heard that.
Needs to be slayed.
Tough decisions are to come, but I guess many of them couldn't come yet. The NDIS, there's agreement from the two major parties, is not sustainable, but there's a review now. You can't cut it now. What are you cutting? Defence, again, it's going to be something where we need to find more efficiencies. I've always said, money's what goes to die in the defence portfolio. But again, there's a review going on. So whilst there was criticism, where are the tough decisions, many of them couldn't really be made yet.
No, and I think even weeks and weeks ahead of the October budget, you had Albo and Chalmers saying, yeah, this is sort of what the budget is probably going to look like. Remember, there's one in May. Remember, there's one in May. And we were hearing that for weeks leading up to Tuesday. We're still hearing that now, because there is a sense of, this is something of a, Labor's just come to power in the last sort of 4 or 5 months. We're going to have a bit of a look, do a bit of restraint, budget repair, etc. And then we can expect some of the other things, some of the decisions on what you're talking about here, etc., to come out in May. And that's the frame that they're putting this budget in.
There's not much low-hanging fruit right now if you look at either savings or raising money. But maybe the juiciest apple that's fallen down in the orchard might be the PRRT. So this right now applies to gas, but it raises very little money, especially compared to other countries that make billions and billions out of gas. Increasing hints Labor might go here?
Yeah, well, look, it's interesting. The Treasurer was only a fortnight ago saying that his predecessor had started some work within the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet, within Treasury, to look at this, the PRRT, and sort of I think it's widely accepted that it's probably not working as effectively as it could. Now, he had previously said, at some stage they'll restart that work, no doubt. And I think in the last 48 hours he started to hint, well, actually that work's already started to begin again, and quite rightfully so, given that we've seen huge increases in gas prices, and a lot of that is effectively going to profit margins, and we're not
getting the benefit from money in the coffers or low gas prices. So something, you'd think
something's got to give, you'd think. And I mean, already he's pretty strongly hinted on budget day that they're looking at potential interventions in the market as well.
Yeah.
We saw that the heads of agreement that Madeleine King struck with the gas giants, that's on supply. There's clearly a push within the government that they want to see something on prices as well.
That's really at the margins. Let's not run out of gas, but it doesn't solve the problems we were talking about. Want to get to industrial relations, and I know you've looked at this before. The core question when you come in and say, here, we need to change things is, are wages a problem? Now, we know right now they're way behind inflation, but that's inflation we hope is a temporary issue. So what wages issue are we looking at in the country?
Well, there's two kind of questions that get sort of merged here. There's the current sort of negative real wages because inflation's going through the roof, and of course that means that people's purchasing power goes backwards. But when you hear the union movement, Sally McManus yesterday or Tony Burke sort of talking about wages, they're talking about structural issues, and you hear this wages stagnating over a decade. Now, the ABS did a really interesting piece of analysis a few weeks back that basically looked at, well, what had happened with wages over the decade when you removed mining. And it showed that effectively wages as a share of national income had actually edged up over the last decade.
So the decade, most of the coalition in power, Labor for a small part of it, that share, there's so many different measures of this, but the share of what's coming in got better for employees.
By about 1.5 percentage points.
Against rhetoric.
Now, the reason, of course, is because when you add in the mining companies, their profits are so massive, so significant that all of that data gets skewed. And the RBA
you're never going to give a mining worker a percent of each bit of coal that comes in. That's the point.
Well,
right?
they also employ about 2% of workers.
Right.
So and look, I think there's perfectly legitimate debates to be had around wages and around productivity in particular, because that's anyone will tell you that's the most significant driver of real wages growth over our past. But ultimately, if we start conflating these things and we don't actually look at the why, then the debate kind of goes off the rails a little bit.
And yet it might still be a bit tricky for the coalition's response to be there's no wages problem, because right now there is one with inflation and it seems to be, this was something Labor was incredibly successful on in their campaign. Now, they haven't been successful in getting it going afterwards, but everything's going up except your wages. That was the killer line, right?
The spending that $1 a day or whatever,
the
$1
$1
that Albo held up. It is that thing where, when you particularly see everyone suffering so much when it comes to cost of living and so on, and this talk about wages and wage stagnation, I mean, how you launch an argument against that or, needing to get those up, doing that, you'd have to be pretty deft. I'm not sure how you can do that without Labor then weaponising that significantly against you, because it's such a being felt so keenly. Yes, right now, but I don't imagine we'll get to the middle of next year and suddenly the light switch goes off and we're all thinking, oh no, now I'm being paid enough or whatever. It's going to still be something that's quite that we all kind of feel and it's still very raw and for most of the term.
I guess the coalition just falls in line in terms of what employer groups are raising in terms of their issues with this and see how it plays out. There's
some really, really big employer groups and businesses who are very concerned about a lot of IR reform that Labor has. And they're big employers and they offer a lot to the economy. So, look, the coalition just getting behind them and saying, listen, we know that these employer groups who do employ thousands or hundreds of thousands of Australians have these concerns, they need to be heard. That's kind of a way to do it, in a way that's just trying to get that view across, I suppose.
The bill's only recently dropped. I can't see it passing by December 1 just because even people that think maybe something should happen say, let's have some more time before momentous changes. Maybe I'll look silly saying that, but it just seems as though the crossbench will at least need to look at it. One of the core bits when we're talking about multi-employer bargaining, not to get too pointy on this because it's one of those unwieldy pieces, will this push deals towards forced arbitration, which might not be too bad, you just get a Fair Work Commission ruling, or strikes, which gets more problematic?
Well, I mean, that's the big question. I think employer groups certainly want a lot more detail. We had sort of Tony Burke out saying that, employer groups were given, or key stakeholders were given a day a week ago to look through the legislation. It's 250 pages. The document that explains the legislation is about 20 pages more. I think there's a reasonable view that perhaps there's not enough time has been given to review on this.
Seriously short period of time.
This is probably the most complex reforms to industrial relations since the introduction of the Fair Work Act.
Yeah.
And I mean, if you've got Tony Burke out today saying that in fact they may need to introduce government amendments to make it better, well, why are you introducing government amendments after it's been introduced and not actually going through the process of making the bill right before it is?
I think also David Pocock in the Senate tried to get more time on the inquiry and the hearing over this, and it was beaten by just like one vote or something because of Hanson. But there's a huge feeling across the political aisles that this is pretty unwieldy. It's a big, big contentious piece of leg. It's going to affect a lot of people. We need a lot of time to go through it.
It's always a big Saturday paper edition after the budget. I'll let you get back to working on those Saturday papers, Sarah Ison and Ron Misen. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks, John.